The conference room fell silent as Colonel Mitchell slid the classified mission folder across the polished table. Every pair of eyes in that room was fixed on one name at the top of the personnel list. Not the decorated Navy SEAL sitting to my left. Not the Marine sniper who'd completed 17 successful extractions. Not even the Air Force pilot with more confirmed kills than anyone else in the building. It was mine, Marcus Thompson. The guy they called desk jockey behind my back. The analyst who'd never fired a shot in anger. The one they thought was too scared to see real combat. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Fort Braxton had a way of making you feel small, even when you belonged there. The sprawling North Carolina base housed some of the most elite military units in the world. And walking through those halls, you could feel the weight of that reputation pressing down on your shoulders. I'd been stationed there for 3 years, working in the intelligence division, and every single day reminded me that I wasn't like the others. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've never killed anyone. In a place where combat tours were worn like badges of honor, that made me an outsider. While other soldiers swapped stories about firefights in Afghanistan or covert operations in Syria, I spent my days hunched over computer screens, analyzing satellite imagery and intercepting enemy communications. My weapon of choice wasn't an M4 carbine or a sniper rifle. It was a keyboard and 3 massive monitors that displayed more classified information than most people would see in a lifetime. The mockery started almost immediately after I arrived. It wasn't outright harassment. The military has rules about that sort of thing. But it was there, subtle and constant. Captain Rodriguez would assign me desk duty during field exercises, claiming they needed someone to hold down the fort. Sergeant Williams would joke about keeping me away from anything sharper than a pencil. Even the civilian contractors who worked in our building would smirk when I walked by, knowing I was the intelligence guy who'd never actually seen intelligence gathering in the field. The worst part wasn't the jokes or the sideways glances, it was the assumption that I was afraid. That I'd chosen analysis work because I was too scared to face real danger. They thought I was hiding behind my security clearance and my computer screens, playing it safe while real soldiers put their lives on the line. What they didn't understand, what none of them could understand, was that I hadn't ended up in this role by accident. My journey to Fort Braxton began at MIT, where I'd studied computer science and international relations. While my classmates were landing jobs at tech companies or investment firms, I was recruited by a Defense Department program that specialized in something they called cognitive warfare. It wasn't about physical combat. It was about understanding how enemy organizations thought, how they planned, and most importantly, how they could be predicted. The training was unlike anything I'd expected. Instead of learning to shoot targets, I learned to read people. Instead of physical conditioning, I underwent psychological profiling. They taught me to recognize patterns in human behavior that others missed, to spot deception in encrypted communications, and to predict enemy movements based on seemingly random data points. It was chess, but the pieces were real people and the stakes were life and death. But try explaining that to a group of Special Forces operators who measured success in confirmed kills and successful extractions. To them, analysis was just a support function. Something necessary, maybe, but not particularly important. Certainly not dangerous. They saw my job as reading reports and making educated guesses, not as the complex psychological warfare it actually was. The breaking point came during a joint training exercise in the Virginia mountains. Our unit was tasked with locating and neutralizing a simulated terrorist cell that had established a base somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was supposed to be a routine exercise, the kind of thing these guys had done hundreds of times before, but something felt wrong from the moment I saw the briefing materials. The intelligence package was too clean, the supposed terrorist communications were too obvious, their security protocols too sloppy. Real insurgent groups, especially the sophisticated ones we'd been tracking lately, didn't make these kinds of mistakes. They didn't use predictable encryption methods or establish bases in locations that were tactically disadvantageous. But when I tried to voice these concerns during the mission briefing, I was quickly shut down. "Leave the tactical analysis to people who've actually been in combat, Thompson," Major Harrison had said, not even looking up from his maps. "Your job is to tell us what the intercepts say, not to question the intelligence." The rest of the team nodded in agreement. After all, what could the desk jockey possibly know about real-world operations? They had decades of combined combat experience between them. I had spreadsheets and satellite photos. The hierarchy was clear, and I was firmly at the bottom of it. So I kept my mouth shut and watched as they planned an assault on a target that felt fundamentally wrong to me. Every instinct I developed over 3 years of analysis work was screaming that something was off, but I'd learned that voicing those instincts only led to more mockery. Better to let them handle it their way and prove, once again, that Marcus Thompson wasn't cut out for real military operations. The mission launched at dawn on a Tuesday morning. I remained back at base, monitoring communications and providing real-time intelligence support from my usual spot behind a computer screen. Through drone feeds and radio chatter, I watched as Alpha Team advanced toward the coordinates where the terrorist base was supposed to be located. Everything proceeded according to plan for the first 2 hours. Then the shooting started. But it wasn't coming from the target location. The gunfire was erupting from positions that shouldn't have existed, places where our intelligence had indicated the area was clear. Through my headset, I could hear the confusion in the team's voices as they found themselves under attack from multiple directions by an enemy that had somehow anticipated their every move. "Command, we're taking heavy fire from the North Ridge," came Major Harrison's voice, tight with stress. "Intelligence said this area was clear." "Negative, Alpha Team," replied Colonel Mitchell from the command center. "Satellite imagery from this morning confirms no hostile presence in that sector." But I was already pulling up different satellite images, older ones that the briefing team had dismissed as irrelevant. Cross-referencing them with weather patterns, local population movements, and a dozen other data points that most people would consider meaningless noise, the pattern that emerged made my blood run cold. This wasn't a terrorist base they were attacking, it was a trap. And somehow, our own intelligence had been compromised in a way that was so sophisticated, so carefully planned, that it had fooled everyone, except the one person nobody bothered to listen to. The guy they called Desk Jockey was about to become the only thing standing between Alpha Team and a disaster that would make headlines around the world. The command center erupted into chaos as Alpha Team's situation deteriorated rapidly. Through the static-filled radio transmissions, we could hear the sharp crack of sniper fire and the distinctive whine of ricocheting bullets. Major Harrison's voice had lost its usual confidence, replaced by the clipped, urgent tone of someone fighting for survival. "We've got at least 12 shooters in elevated positions," he reported between bursts of gunfire. "This isn't some ragtag militia group. These guys know what they're doing." I stared at my screens, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I pulled up every piece of data I could find about the area. Weather reports from the past month, cell phone tower usage patterns, even grocery store sales receipts from nearby towns. To most people, it would look like random information, but patterns were emerging, patterns that told a story no one else was seeing. Colonel Mitchell paced behind the row of analysts, his jaw tight with frustration. "How the hell did we miss this? Our intelligence was solid. 3 separate sources confirmed that location." That's when it hit me. 3 separate sources. In intelligence work, multiple confirmations usually meant you had reliable information. But sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, multiple confirmations meant someone was very good at feeding you exactly what they wanted you to believe. I raised my hand, knowing full well how it would be received. "Sir, I think I know what happened." The colonel barely glanced in my direction. "Not now, Thompson. We need solutions, not theories." But I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Not while good soldiers were pinned down because everyone had ignored the warning signs I'd spotted from the beginning. "Sir, with respect, I think our sources were compromised. This entire operation was designed to draw our team into that exact location." The room fell silent except for the ongoing radio chatter from the field. Captain Rodriguez, who had always been particularly vocal about my lack of combat experience, turned in his chair to face me. "Thompson, Unless you've suddenly developed X-ray vision and can see through mountains, I suggest you stick to what you know. That's exactly what I'm doing, I shot back, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Look at the pattern of attacks. They're not random. Each position was chosen to create overlapping fields of fire that would force our team into a specific kill zone. This isn't an ambush, it's a chess game, and we walked right into checkmate. Colonel Mitchell stopped pacing. For the first time since I'd started working at Fort Braxton, he was actually listening to me. Explain. I stood up and moved to the large display screen at the front of the room, pulling up a topographical map of the area. The intelligence package we received 3 days ago contained precise coordinates for the terrorist base. But look at these satellite images from 2 weeks earlier. I overlaid the older imagery onto the current map. There's construction activity here, here, and here, small scale, easily missed unless you're looking for it. Construction could mean anything, Captain Rodriguez interjected. Doesn't prove it's a trap. You're right, but cross-reference it with local cell phone data. I pulled up another layer of information. Heavy usage in these areas during off-peak hours, always lasting exactly 47 minutes. That's not random communication, that's coordinated planning sessions. The radio crackled with another urgent transmission from Alpha Team. Command, we need immediate extraction. We're down to our last magazines, and they've got us completely surrounded. Colonel Mitchell's face had gone pale. How long do we have? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I was already running calculations in my head, factoring in ammunition loads, enemy positions, and the terrain features that would affect any rescue attempt. Based on their rate of fire and standard ammunition loads, maybe 20 minutes before they're completely defenseless. Can we get another team to them in 20 minutes? I shook my head. Not through conventional routes. The enemy positions are too well established. But there might be another way. For the next few minutes, I walked the command staff through what I'd discovered. The supposed terrorist base wasn't a base at all. It was bait. Someone had spent weeks, possibly months, setting up an elaborate deception designed to lure in exactly the kind of elite team we'd sent. They'd planted false intelligence, established fake communication patterns, and even gone so far as to create physical evidence that would fool satellite surveillance. But in their thoroughness, they'd made a mistake. A small one, but enough for someone who understood how to read between the lines of data. The construction activity I'd spotted wasn't just defensive positions, it was also access tunnels. Old mining shafts that connected to a network of caves running throughout the mountain range. There's a maintenance road that leads to an abandoned mining operation about 2 miles north of Alpha Team's position, I explained, highlighting the route on the map. According to geological surveys from the 1970s, there's a tunnel system that comes up right behind the main ambush positions. Captain Rodriguez was studying the map intently, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional interest. Even if that's true, we'd need someone who knows those tunnels intimately. Someone who's been down there before. Or someone who's spent the last 3 years studying every inch of terrain in a 100-mile radius, I replied quietly. The implications of what I was suggesting hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Colonel Mitchell looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not dismissal or patronizing tolerance, but actual consideration. Thompson, are you saying you want to go out there? The question hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of mockery, 3 years of being treated like I was afraid of real danger, and now they were asking if I wanted to voluntarily walk into an active combat zone. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was insane. I was an analyst, not a field operative. My expertise was in reading data, not navigating hostile territory while people were shooting at each other. But Alpha Team was running out of time, and I was the only person in that room who understood the full scope of what we were dealing with. The enemy hadn't just set a trap, they'd set a perfect trap, one that accounted for every conventional response we might attempt. Except for one possibility they couldn't have anticipated. The desk jockey who'd been studying their methods for months without anyone taking him seriously. Sir, I can guide a rescue team through those tunnels. I know the layout better than anyone else here. Negative, Colonel Mitchell said immediately. "You're not qualified for field operations. We'll send Bravo team with the route information you've provided." "With respect, sir, that won't work. The tunnel system is too complex to navigate from a briefing. There are dozens of branches, multiple levels, and several areas where the maps are incomplete or inaccurate. Someone needs to be there who can read the terrain and make real-time decisions based on geological markers and structural indicators." Another burst of gunfire came through the radio, followed by Major Harrison's increasingly desperate voice. "Command, we're taking casualties. Sergeant Williams is down, and we've got 2 more wounded. We need help now." The clock on the wall showed 14:37. By my calculations, Alpha Team had maybe 15 minutes left before their situation became completely untenable. In the sudden silence that followed Harrison's transmission, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Colonel Mitchell stared at me for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Thompson, you understand what you're volunteering for? This isn't a computer simulation. If you're wrong about those tunnels, or if the enemy has them covered, you won't be coming back." I thought about all the times I'd been dismissed, all the jokes about keeping me away from sharp objects, all the assumptions that I was too scared to handle real danger. Then I thought about Alpha Team, pinned down and running out of options, because everyone had been too proud to listen to the intelligence that could have prevented this disaster. "I understand, sir, but I'm the only one who can get them out." 20 minutes later, I found myself strapped into tactical gear that felt foreign against my body, riding in the back of a Humvee speeding through the Virginia wilderness. Staff Sergeant Davis, a demolitions expert with arms like tree trunks, sat across from me checking his equipment for the 3rd time. Corporal Chen, their communications specialist, was running final tests on the radio gear. Neither of them had said much since we'd left base, but I could feel their skepticism radiating like heat from a furnace. The plan was straightforward in theory, terrifying in practice. We'd approach the abandoned mining facility from the east, using a dry creek bed to mask our approach. I would guide them through the tunnel system to emerge behind the enemy positions, allowing us to break the ambush from an unexpected angle. Simple. Clean. Assuming I was right about everything. 2 minutes out, called the driver, and my stomach clenched like a fist. Through the bulletproof windows, I could see the outline of the mountains where Alpha Team was fighting for their lives. The radio chatter had grown more sporadic over the past few minutes, which wasn't a good sign. Either they were conserving ammunition or they were too busy staying alive to report their status. Staff Sergeant Davis leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "Thompson, I want you to understand something. Once we're in those tunnels, you're calling the shots. I don't care if you've never held a rifle in anger. Down there, your knowledge keeps us alive. But if this goes sideways, if we get lost or trapped, there won't be time for second guessing. You sure about this?" I met his gaze, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "I've studied these tunnels for 2 years as part of a geological survey project. I know every major passage, every structural weakness, every exit point. The enemy couldn't have mapped them as thoroughly as I have. And if they have lookouts posted underground, then we adapt. But they won't expect anyone to know about the mining network. Their entire strategy is based on controlling the high ground and the obvious approach routes. They can't watch everything." Quote, "The Humvee lurched to a stop beside a cluster of rusted mining equipment that hadn't been used since the 1980s. The old mine entrance was partially collapsed, blocked by decades of accumulated debris, and what looked like a deliberate attempt to seal it permanently. To most people, it would appear completely impassable. But I'd spent months analyzing geological surveys and historical mining records. The main entrance might be blocked, but there was a ventilation shaft about 50 meters to the north that connected to the same tunnel system. It would be a tight squeeze, and we'd have to rappel down 30 feet in complete darkness. But it was our only option. There, I pointed to what looked like just another pile of rocks and twisted metal. The shaft opening is hidden under that debris. Corporal Chen gave me a look that suggested he thought I'd lost my mind. "Thompson, that's not an entrance, that's just a hole in the ground." Exactly what it's supposed to look like. I was already moving toward the concealed opening, my newly acquired tactical flashlight cutting through the shadows. Help me clear this debris. It took precious minutes to uncover the shaft opening, and with each passing second, I could feel the weight of Alpha Team's situation pressing down on us. The radio had been silent for almost 10 minutes now, which could mean they were maintaining communication discipline, or it could mean something much worse. The shaft was exactly where the 1977 survey maps indicated it would be, though it was smaller than I'd hoped. We'd have to go down one at a time, which would make us vulnerable if we encountered resistance below. But there was no alternative. Alpha Team was running out of time, and this was the only route that might catch the enemy off guard. "I'll go first," I announced, clipping my rappelling gear to the anchor point Davis had established. "Once I confirm the tunnel system is accessible, you follow at 30-second intervals." Staff Sergeant Davis grabbed my arm before I could begin my descent. "Thompson, you've never done anything like this before. Let me take point." I shook my head firmly. "You don't know the layout. If we hit a junction or a collapsed section, you won't know which way to go. This has to be me." The descent into darkness was unlike anything I'd experienced. The shaft walls were rough limestone, carved out by hand tools more than half a century ago. Water seeped through cracks in the stone, making the surface slippery and treacherous. My tactical gear caught on protruding rocks twice, forcing me to carefully work myself free while suspended in the void. When my boots finally touched solid ground, I was in a tunnel that stretched away in both directions, disappearing into absolute blackness. The air was stale and heavy, carrying the metallic scent of mineral deposits and something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Fresh cigarette smoke. I froze, my hand instinctively moving toward the sidearm I'd been issued but had never expected to use. Someone had been in these tunnels recently. Very recently. Which meant either the enemy was more thorough than I'd anticipated, or we weren't the first people to have this idea. The sound of boots on rock echoed from somewhere ahead, moving away from my position. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to control my breathing as I waited for Davis and Chen to complete their descent. Every instinct told me to retreat, to climb back up that shaft and report that the tunnels were compromised. But Alpha Team didn't have time for a new plan. When my teammates reached the bottom, I signaled for complete silence and pointed in the direction of the footsteps. Davis nodded grimly and took point, his rifle ready. I guided them through the tunnel system using hand signals and the detailed mental map I'd memorized from years of geological surveys. The passages were more complex than I'd remembered from the diagrams. Side tunnels branched off at irregular intervals, some leading to dead ends where mining operations had stopped, others connecting to deeper levels that weren't marked on any official survey. More than once, we had to backtrack when I realized we'd taken a wrong turn, each mistake eating into our dwindling time window. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached the section of tunnel that should emerge near the enemy positions. The passage here was different, newer construction mixed with the old mining works. Someone had been modifying these tunnels, adding reinforcements and what looked like communication cables. That's when I realized the full scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a permanent installation. The enemy hadn't just stumbled onto the tunnel system. They'd been planning this operation for months, maybe longer. They'd chosen this location specifically because of the underground access, and they'd modified it to suit their needs. We were walking into a trap that was even more sophisticated than I'd initially believed, but we were also the only hope Alpha Team had left. As we approached what my calculations indicated should be the exit point, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. Voices speaking in accented English, discussing ammunition counts and field of fire. The enemy was using the tunnels too, treating them as a supply route and command center for their ambush operation. Staff Sergeant Davis moved up beside me, his expression grim in the green glow of our night vision equipment. Through hand signals, he indicated he'd counted at least 4 distinct voices, all coming from a chamber just ahead of our position. We had found the enemy's underground command post, but they had no idea we were coming. The underground command chamber was larger than anything shown on the mining surveys, clearly excavated specifically for this operation. Through a crack in the stone wall, I could see 4 men hunched over tactical maps spread across makeshift tables. Banks of communication equipment lined one wall, their displays casting an eerie blue glow across faces I didn't recognize, but whose tactical gear suggested serious military training. What struck me most wasn't their equipment or their obvious professionalism, it was how comfortable they seemed. These weren't insurgents who'd stumbled onto a good ambush site. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been planning this operation for months, maybe years. Every piece of equipment had its designated place. Every communication protocol was being followed to the letter. Staff Sergeant Davis positioned himself at the chamber entrance while Corporal Chen set up overwatch from a concealed position further back in the tunnel. Through our headsets, I could hear the tactical frequency that Alpha Team had been using, but it was completely silent now. Either they were maintaining strict radio discipline, or there was no one left to transmit. The enemy commander, a lean man with graying temples who spoke with what sounded like an Eastern European accent, was coordinating the final phase of their operation. Sector 7 reports all targets are stationary. No movement for the past 12 minutes. Ammunition status? Asked another voice. They fired their last coordinated volley 8 minutes ago. Sporadic shots only since then. Another 10 minutes and we can move to the collection phase. Collection phase? My blood went cold as I realized what that meant. This wasn't just about eliminating Alpha Team. They planned to capture survivors, extract intelligence, and possibly use them for propaganda purposes. The kind of sophisticated psychological warfare that required extensive planning and resources, far beyond what a typical terrorist cell could muster. I signaled to Davis, pointing to my watch and holding up 10 fingers. He nodded grimly. We had at most 10 minutes before the enemy moved from their defensive positions to actively hunt down what remained of Alpha Team. Once that happened, any rescue attempt would become exponentially more difficult. But attacking 4 well-armed, professionally trained operatives in their prepared position wasn't exactly what I'd trained for during my years of computer analysis. Davis and Chen were both experienced soldiers, but they were outnumbered and fighting on the enemy's chosen ground. We needed an advantage that pure firepower couldn't provide. That's when I noticed something the others had missed. The communication cables I'd spotted earlier weren't just running to the radio equipment, they extended deeper into the tunnel system, connecting to what looked like a sophisticated surveillance network. The enemy hadn't just chosen this location for its tactical advantages, they'd turned the entire mountain into an electronic monitoring station. Which meant they could see everything happening on the surface, track every movement Alpha Team made, and coordinate their ambush with precision that would be impossible through normal means. But it also meant they were dependent on that electronic network for their tactical superiority. I caught Davis's attention and pointed to the cable runs, then made a cutting motion across my throat. He understood immediately. If we could disable their surveillance network, the enemy would be operating blind, giving Alpha Team a chance to break free from their trapped position. The problem was accessing the cables without alerting the command team to our presence. The main cable bundle ran along the ceiling of the chamber, just out of easy reach but perfectly positioned to provide maximum vulnerability to anyone who knew where to look. Chen had positioned himself where he could cover the chamber entrance, but the angle wasn't right for what we needed to do. We'd have to move closer, which meant exposing ourselves to discovery. In a direct firefight, our chances weren't good. The enemy had superior numbers, better positions, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. But sometimes the best tactical advantage isn't superior firepower. It's superior information. And after 3 years of studying every aspect of these mountains, I had information they couldn't possibly possess. The mining surveys from the 1970s had included detailed structural analyses of the tunnel system, including load-bearing assessments and geological stability reports. What I'd memorized as academic curiosities suddenly became tactical intelligence of the highest value. The chamber we were observing had been excavated from naturally occurring limestone formations, but the ceiling was supported by timber beams that were nearly 50 years old. More importantly, those beams were connected to a larger support network that extended throughout this section of the tunnel system. If someone knew exactly where to apply pressure, or where to plant a small explosive charge, the resulting structural failure could be precisely controlled. I sketched out a rough diagram on a piece of paper, showing Davis the structural weak points I'd identified. His eyes widened as he understood what I was proposing. Instead of a direct assault on the command post, we could collapse specific sections of the tunnel system, sealing off the enemy's escape routes while leaving our own exit path intact. It was incredibly risky. If my calculations were wrong, we could bring down the entire section and trap ourselves underground. If the enemy detected our preparations, they'd have plenty of time to eliminate us before the charges detonated. And if the structural collapse was more extensive than anticipated, we might inadvertently harm Alpha Team on the surface. But it was also the kind of unconventional approach that the enemy couldn't have planned for. Their entire operation was based on controlling the surface terrain and using their underground facility as a secure command center. They'd never considered the possibility that someone might understand the geological structure well enough to turn their own stronghold against them. Davis examined my structural analysis, cross-referencing it with the explosive materials he'd brought for the mission. After several tense minutes, he gave me a thumbs up. The plan was feasible, but we'd have to work fast and with absolute precision. Chen remained in overwatch position while Davis and I moved deeper into the tunnel system, locating the structural points I'd identified from the geological surveys. The old timber supports were exactly where the 1970s documentation indicated they would be, and their condition was consistent with my analysis of environmental factors and natural deterioration rates. Setting the charges required moving through sections of tunnel that weren't on any official map, following passages that had been sealed off during the original mining operations but were still structurally connected to the main system. My knowledge of the geological formations became critical as we navigated through areas where a wrong turn could lead to a dead end or a potentially dangerous collapse. The work was delicate and nerve-wracking. Each explosive charge had to be positioned with mathematical precision to ensure the structural failure would propagate in exactly the right direction. Too much force, and we'd bring down sections we needed to remain intact. Too little, and the enemy command post would remain operational. As we worked, I could hear the enemy communications continuing through our monitoring equipment. They were growing more confident, discussing their plans for the collection phase, with the casual professionalism of people who believed they'd already won. What they didn't realize was that their electronic superiority was about to become their greatest vulnerability. When the last charge was in position, we retreated to a safe distance and prepared for what would either be a tactical masterpiece or a catastrophic miscalculation. Davis looked at me one final time, his finger hovering over the detonator. "Thompson, you absolutely sure about this?" I thought about Alpha Team, trapped on the surface with no ammunition and no hope of conventional rescue. I thought about 3 years of being dismissed as someone too scared for real military operations. I thought about all the times my analysis had been ignored because it came from someone who'd never fired a shot in anger. I'm sure, do it. The detonation was nothing like what I'd expected from movies or training videos. Instead of a thunderous explosion, there was a deep, rumbling groan that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The tunnel floor vibrated beneath our feet as tons of limestone and timber support beams shifted in precisely the way I'd calculated they would. Through our communication intercepts, we could hear the enemy's confident chatter transform into panic within seconds. Their electronic displays went dark one by one as the carefully positioned charges severed power cables and collapsed the sections of tunnel that housed their surveillance equipment. What had been a sophisticated command center became a tomb of twisted metal and broken stone. "What the hell was that?" came a frantic voice through their radio network. "Command, we've lost all visual on the targets. Repeat, all cameras are down." "Generator room is not responding," reported another voice. "We're running on battery power only." But the most satisfying sound was what we didn't hear. The calm, professional coordination that had characterized their communications up until that moment. Without their electronic advantage, they were operating blind, reduced to the same basic tactical situation as any other group of soldiers caught in unfamiliar terrain. Davis clapped me on the shoulder, his expression showing a respect I'd never seen before. "Thompson, that was surgical. How the hell did you know exactly which supports to target?" "Geological survey from 1977, I replied, trying to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from sources nobody thinks to classify. But our work wasn't finished. The structural collapse had eliminated the enemy's technological advantage and sealed off their underground command center. But Alpha Team was still trapped on the surface. We needed to reach them before the enemy ground forces realized what had happened and adapted their tactics accordingly. Chen's voice crackled through our headsets as we moved toward the surface exit point. I'm picking up movement on the enemy's tactical frequency. Sounds like they're trying to re-establish communication with their command element. How much time do we have? I asked. Hard to say. They're disciplined. But losing their entire command structure is going to create confusion. Maybe 15 minutes before they reorganize and figure out what happened. We emerged from the tunnel system at a point approximately 200 meters behind the main enemy positions, exactly where my analysis of the mining maps had indicated we would. The Virginia mountains stretched around us in the early afternoon sunlight, looking deceptively peaceful despite the life-and-death struggle taking place on their slopes. From our elevated position, I could see the tactical situation with perfect clarity. Alpha Team had taken shelter behind a cluster of boulders about 600 meters down the slope, but they were completely pinned down by enemy fire from at least 8 different positions. The terrain offered no escape routes that weren't covered by overlapping fields of fire, a textbook example of a perfectly executed ambush. But without their electronic surveillance network, the enemy couldn't see us approaching from behind. Their entire defensive strategy was based on maintaining visual contact with Alpha Team, while using their underground command center to coordinate movements. With that coordination gone, they were just individual shooters in fixed positions. Davis was studying the enemy positions through his scope, mentally calculating angles and distances. We can take out maybe 3 or 4 of them before they realize we're here. But that still leaves Alpha Team exposed to fire from the remaining positions. Not if we do this right, I said, pulling out the tactical map I'd been working on throughout our underground infiltration. Look at their positioning. They've arranged themselves to create interlocking fields of fire that cover all the obvious escape routes. But they're vulnerable to a coordinated attack from multiple directions. I outlined my plan using the terrain features I'd memorized from satellite imagery and geological surveys. Instead of trying to eliminate all the enemy positions through direct fire, we would use the mountain's natural acoustics to create the illusion of a much larger force attacking from several directions simultaneously. You want to fake a full-scale assault? Chen asked, clearly skeptical. With 3 people? Not fake, redirect, watch. I pointed to a series of rock formations that formed a natural amphitheater around the enemy positions. Sound travels in predictable ways through limestone formations like these. A single gunshot fired from the right position will echo off those rock faces and appear to come from 3 different directions. Davis was beginning to see the possibilities. So he moved between positions, using the terrain to multiply our apparent numbers while Alpha Team uses the confusion to break out of their trap. Exactly. But it has to be perfectly timed. If the enemy realizes what we're doing before Alpha Team can move, they'll just redirect their fire toward us. We had one significant advantage the enemy couldn't counter. I knew this terrain better than anyone else in these mountains. While they'd spent months preparing their ambush positions, I'd spent years studying every geological feature, every acoustic property, every line of sight within a 50-mile radius. The attack began with Chen moving to an overwatch position that gave him clear shots at the 2 easternmost enemy positions. His first rifle shot rang out across the mountainside, immediately followed by Davis firing from a position 200 meters to the south. The echoes bounced off the limestone cliffs exactly as I'd predicted, creating the impression of gunfire coming from at least 5 different locations. But the key to the entire operation was what happened next. Instead of continuing to fire from fixed positions, we immediately moved to new locations, using natural features to mask our movements while maintaining the illusion of a coordinated assault by a much larger force. I found myself in a position I'd never imagined during my years of analysis work, belly down on a mountainside, using my rifle to provide covering fire while American soldiers moved to safety. The weapon felt strange in my hands, but my understanding of ballistics and trajectory calculations made up for my lack of practical experience. The enemy's response was exactly what I'd hoped for: confused, uncoordinated, and increasingly desperate as they tried to identify targets that seemed to be everywhere at once. Without their command center to provide tactical coordination, they were reacting to threats instead of implementing a coherent strategy. Alpha Team, this is Rescue 6, Davis called over the radio. We are engaging enemy positions from the North Ridge. Recommend you move to Extract Point Charlie on my signal. Major Harrison's voice came back immediately, tight with exhaustion but still professional. Rescue 6, confirm your identity. How do you know our call signs? Sir, this is Staff Sergeant Davis with a rescue element. We have Thompson with us. There was a pause that lasted several seconds. Thompson, the analyst? Affirmative, sir. He's the one who figured out how to get us behind their positions. Another pause, longer this time. When Harrison spoke again, his tone had changed completely. Copy that, Rescue 6. Alpha Team is ready to move on your signal. The breakout happened faster than I'd anticipated. As soon as the enemy realized they were taking fire from multiple directions, their carefully coordinated ambush began to fall apart. Individual shooters started repositioning to engage what they thought were new threats, leaving gaps in their coverage that Alpha Team could exploit. Within minutes, we had successfully extracted all surviving members of Alpha Team and begun moving toward the extraction point. The enemy, still confused about the size and location of the rescue force, made several attempts to re-establish their ambush but couldn't coordinate their efforts without their underground command center. As we moved through the mountain terrain towards safety, Major Harrison fell into step beside me. The man who'd dismissed my tactical concerns just hours earlier was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Thompson, he said quietly, I owe you an apology, and probably my life. Just doing my job, sir. No, he replied firmly. What you did today? That wasn't analysis work. That was warfare at the highest level. And it saved every one of us. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I truly belonged at Fort Braxton. The debriefing room at Fort Braxton felt different 3 days later. Instead of being relegated to a corner chair while the real soldiers discussed operational details, I found myself sitting at the head of the conference table, fielding questions from a room full of senior officers who hung on every word of my tactical analysis. Colonel Mitchell had assembled representatives from multiple intelligence agencies, special operations commands, and even a delegation from the Pentagon, who'd flown down specifically to understand how a desk analyst had successfully countered what they were calling the most sophisticated ambush operation ever attempted on American soil. The enemy's primary mistake, I explained to the assembled officers, was assuming that technological superiority could replace fundamental tactical principles. They built their entire operation around maintaining electronic dominance, but they failed to account for someone who understood the terrain better than their surveillance systems did. General Patricia Hawkins, a stern woman with silver hair who commanded the entire Eastern Special Operations Division, leaned forward in her chair. Thompson, our preliminary investigation suggests this wasn't a random terrorist cell. The level of planning, the quality of equipment, the sophistication of their electronic warfare capabilities. We're looking at state-sponsored operations. The implications of that statement settled over the room like a lead blanket. If a foreign government had successfully infiltrated American territory and established a permanent surveillance installation, it represented a security breach of unprecedented magnitude. More troubling was the possibility that this might not be an isolated incident. How many other sites like this could be out there? Asked Colonel Mitchell. I'd been thinking about that question for the past 3 days, cross-referencing the tactical methods we'd encountered with similar geological formations throughout the region. Based on the construction techniques and the specific equipment they were using, I'd estimate they need very particular terrain features. Remote locations with existing underground access, minimal local population, but close enough to major military installations to provide valuable intelligence. Give me a number, Thompson. I pulled up the geological survey I'd been working on, highlighting locations that met the criteria we'd identified. In Virginia and North Carolina alone, maybe 12 sites that would work for this type of operation. Expand that to the entire eastern seaboard, and you're looking at potentially 40 or 50 locations. The silence that followed was deafening. General Hawkins exchanged glances with her staff officers before speaking again. Thompson, How quickly could you identify the most likely sites for this type of installation? Given access to the right databases and satellite imagery, maybe 2 weeks for a comprehensive analysis. But that's assuming I can work with a team that understands both the geological and tactical requirements. You'll have whatever resources you need, she replied immediately, but I want more than just identification. If there are other sites out there, we need to know how to counter them, using the same methods that worked in Virginia. Over the following weeks, I found myself at the center of an operation that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. Instead of working alone in a cramped office analyzing routine intelligence reports, I was leading a joint task force that included geologists, electronic warfare specialists, and some of the most experienced special operations personnel in the military. The work was unlike anything I'd done before, but it drew on every skill I'd developed during my years of background analysis. We identified 17 potential sites across 6 states, each one representing a possible security threat that could have gone undetected for years without the right analytical approach. But the most satisfying part wasn't the recognition or the expanded responsibilities. It was working with people who finally understood what I brought to the table. Staff Sergeant Davis had requested transfer to my unit, claiming he wanted to work with the smartest tactical mind he'd ever encountered. Corporal Chen had become my primary liaison with electronic warfare specialists, helping translate my geological analyses into actionable intelligence. Even Major Harrison, who'd initially dismissed my concerns about the Virginia operation, had become one of my strongest advocates. During one particularly complex planning session, he'd stood up in front of a room full of senior officers and stated flatly that Thompson's unconventional approach to tactical analysis represents the future of special operations. The breakthrough came during our investigation of a suspected site in the mountains of western North Carolina. Satellite imagery showed construction activity that matched the patterns we'd identified in Virginia, but something about the tactical setup felt wrong. The underground access was there, the terrain features were perfect, but the surface security arrangements didn't match what we'd learned about the enemy's operational methods. It's too obvious, I told the planning team during our final briefing. The Virginia site was successful because it looked exactly what it was supposed to be, an abandoned mining operation that nobody would investigate. This one looks like it's trying too hard to appear innocent. General Hawkins studied the satellite photos I'd marked up with potential threat indicators. You think it's a trap? I think it's a test. Someone knows we figured out their methodology, and they want to see how we respond to a site that appears to match all the criteria but doesn't quite fit the pattern. Quote, the decision was made to approach the North Carolina site using a completely different tactical framework, one that assumed the enemy was aware of our previous success and had adapted their methods accordingly. Instead of the underground infiltration that had worked in Virginia, we developed a strategy based on long-range surveillance and electronic countermeasures. I spent 2 weeks positioned on a mountainside 3 miles from the suspected installation, using advanced optics and electronic monitoring equipment to build a complete picture of enemy activities without alerting them to our presence. The work was tedious and required patience I didn't know I possessed, but it confirmed what I'd suspected. The site was a honeypot designed to capture anyone using the same methods that had succeeded in Virginia. More importantly, our surveillance revealed details about the enemy's organizational structure that changed everything we thought we knew about the threat we were facing. This wasn't just a foreign intelligence operation. It was a systematic attempt to map and neutralize America's special operations capabilities by studying how we responded to specific types of threats. The enemy had been learning from us just as much as we'd been learning from them. Every successful operation, every tactical innovation, every breakthrough in methodology was being analyzed and countered by an adversary who understood our strengths better than we'd realized. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that American military thinking was rigid and predictable, that our responses would follow established doctrine and conventional tactical principles. What they hadn't anticipated was someone who thought about warfare in terms of geology and mathematics, rather than firepower and force projection. The final confrontation came not through direct military action, but through a chess match played out across multiple states, using terrain features and electronic warfare capabilities as the primary weapons. We identified their real operational sites by deliberately feeding false information through channels we knew they were monitoring, then tracking which locations showed increased activity in response to our deceptions. It was warfare conducted through databases and satellite imagery, won not by the side with superior firepower but by the team that better understood how to read the landscape itself. The kind of conflict that could only be fought by someone who'd spent years treating mountains and valleys as tactical intelligence rather than just geographical features. When the operation concluded 6 months later, we'd identified and neutralized 14 enemy installations across the eastern United States, each one representing a security threat that could have operated undetected for years. The success was measured not in enemy casualties, but in prevented intelligence breaches and protected operational capabilities. Standing in the same conference room where I had once been dismissed as just another desk analyst, I found myself briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on tactical methodologies that were being adopted throughout the special operations community. The kid who'd been mocked for skipping combat had become the architect of an entirely new approach to asymmetric warfare. But the most important change wasn't in how others saw me, it was in how I'd learned to see myself. I wasn't someone who'd chosen analysis because he was afraid of real danger. I was someone whose unique combination of skills had made him capable of fighting wars that others couldn't even recognize were being fought. Sometimes the most important battles aren't won with rifles and explosives. Sometimes they're won by the person who understands that knowledge itself can be the most powerful weapon of all. 2 years after the Virginia Mountains incident, I found myself standing in the Pentagon briefing room that I'd only seen in movies, addressing an audience that included the Secretary of Defense and representatives from every major intelligence agency in the country. The presentation I was about to give would fundamentally change how America approached modern warfare, but more personally, it represented the complete transformation of how the military viewed analytical intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, clicking to the first slide of my presentation. What we discovered in the Blue Ridge Mountains wasn't an isolated incident. It was a preview of warfare's future. Conflicts fought not primarily through traditional combat, but through information dominance and terrain manipulation. The screen behind me displayed a world map dotted with red indicators showing suspected enemy installations across 6 continents. Each marker represented months of painstaking analysis, cross-referencing geological surveys with communication intercepts, satellite imagery with economic data, creating a picture of global conflict that most people couldn't even see. Secretary of Defense Jennifer Walsh, a woman whose reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense was legendary, leaned forward at her seat. Thompson, your report suggests we're already in the middle of World War III, but nobody realizes it's happening. That's exactly what I'm suggesting, ma'am. Traditional warfare assumes that conflicts begin with declarations and escalate through recognizable military actions. But what we're facing is something entirely different. A systematic campaign to map, study, and eventually neutralize our military capabilities without ever firing a shot in conventional battle. The evidence was overwhelming once you knew how to look for it. Strange construction projects in remote areas near military installations, communication patterns that didn't match local population demographics, economic investments that made no sense from a business perspective but perfect sense if you were trying to establish observation posts. The Virginia operation wasn't designed to kill Alpha Team, I continued. It was designed to study how we respond to specific types of threats. Every tactical decision we made, every piece of equipment we used, every communication protocol we followed. All of it was being recorded and analyzed by an adversary who's been building a comprehensive database of American military capabilities. General Morrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, interrupted with the question I'd been expecting. If that's true, then how do we fight an enemy we can't see using methods we don't understand? We already know how, sir. We proved it in Virginia and confirmed it through 14 subsequent operations. The key isn't superior firepower or advanced technology. It's superior knowledge of terrain and tactical environments that the enemy assumes we don't possess. I clicked to the next slide, showing the organizational structure we developed over the past 2 years. What had started as my individual analytical approach had evolved into an entirely new branch of military intelligence, one that combined geological expertise with tactical analysis in ways that had never been attempted before. We call it Terrain-Based Intelligence Operations, or TBIO. Instead of waiting for the enemy to reveal themselves through conventional military actions, we identify them through their relationship to geographical and geological features. Every installation they establish, every operation they plan, every strategic position they occupy, all of it depends on terrain features that can be analyzed and predicted. The room was completely silent as I walked them through case studies from our recent operations. The abandoned radar station in Alaska that turned out to be a sophisticated signals intelligence facility. The mining survey project in Colorado that was actually mapping underground access routes to NORAD. The environmental research station in Montana that had been collecting detailed information about missile defense installations. In each case, traditional intelligence methods had classified these as low-priority or non-threatening activities. But when you analyze them through the lens of geological and tactical requirements, the pattern becomes obvious. They're not random operations. They're part of a coordinated campaign to establish permanent observation and interdiction capabilities throughout North America. What made our approach unique wasn't just the analytical methodology. It was how we responded to identified threats. Instead of conventional military strikes that would alert the enemy to our awareness, we used the same terrain-based strategies that had worked in Virginia. Structural engineering to compromise their installations. Acoustic manipulation to create tactical confusion. Electronic warfare targeted at their dependence on technological superiority. The beautiful thing about fighting this type of warfare, I explained, is that the enemy's greatest strength becomes their greatest vulnerability. They've invested years and enormous resources in establishing these installations, but they're all dependent on specific geographical features that can be turned against them by someone who understands the underlying science. Secretary Walsh was studying the operational summaries I'd provided, her expression growing more serious with each page. Thompson, you're describing a complete paradigm shift in how we think about national defense. The budgetary implications alone are probably less than what we spend on a single aircraft carrier, ma'am. TBIO operations require specialized knowledge and careful planning, but they don't require massive troop deployments or expensive weapons systems. A team of 6 people with the right analytical background can neutralize threats that would traditionally require entire battalions to address. The questions that followed revealed both the potential and the challenges of what we were proposing. Military leadership understood the tactical advantages, but they struggled with the institutional changes required to implement terrain-based operations on a large scale. Intelligence agencies saw the analytical value but worried about jurisdictional boundaries. Politicians recognized the cost savings but questioned whether Congress would fund something so different from traditional defense spending. But the most important validation came from an unexpected source. Major Harrison, now Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, had been invited to provide testimony about our operational effectiveness from a field commander's perspective. 2 years ago, I thought Marcus Thompson was someone we kept around to handle paperwork while real soldiers did the actual fighting, he testified. I was wrong about that in ways I'm still discovering. What Thompson and his team have developed isn't just a new approach to intelligence gathering. It's a completely new form of warfare that's perfectly suited to the threats we're actually facing in the 21st century. He paused, looking directly at me before continuing. Traditional special operations training teaches you to be prepared for any situation. But Thompson doesn't just prepare for situations. He creates them. He doesn't just respond to enemy actions. He predicts them and counters them before they happen. That's not analysis work. That's strategic warfare at the highest possible level. The final decision came down to a single question from General Morrison. Thompson, if we give you the resources and authority to expand TBIO operations nationally, what do you need and how quickly can you deliver results? I'd been preparing for this moment for months, developing organizational charts and resource requirements that would allow us to scale our approach from individual operations to systematic national defense. Give me 50 analysts with geological and engineering backgrounds, access to comprehensive satellite imagery databases, and coordination authority with existing special operations units. Within 18 months, we can identify and neutralize every enemy installation currently operating on American soil. And beyond that, quote, Beyond that, we can start teaching other countries how to protect themselves using the same methods. Instead of fighting separate defensive actions against a coordinated enemy campaign, we can create a global network of terrain-based intelligence capabilities that makes this type of infiltration impossible anywhere in the world. The briefing concluded with formal authorization for the most significant expansion of military intelligence operations since the creation of the CIA. But for me, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when Secretary Walsh approached me personally. "Thompson, I've been in this business for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished. You've taken one of the most serious security threats this country has ever faced and turned it into a strategic advantage. That's remarkable work." "Thank you, ma'am. But I should mention that none of this would have been possible without people being willing to listen to ideas that seemed unconventional at first." She smiled. "Sometimes unconventional ideas are the only ones worth having." Walking out of the Pentagon that day, I thought about the journey that had brought me from a dismissed desk analyst to the architect of an entirely new form of national defense. The mockery and skepticism I'd faced at Fort Braxton seemed like ancient history now, replaced by responsibilities I'd never imagined, and respect I'd never expected. But the most important lesson wasn't about personal validation or professional advancement. It was about understanding that expertise comes in many forms. And sometimes the most valuable contributions come from people who think about problems in ways that nobody else has considered. The analysts who were joining my expanded team came from backgrounds in geology, archaeology, environmental science, and mathematics, fields that had never been considered relevant to military operations. But each of them brought perspectives that could reveal threats and opportunities that traditional military thinking would miss entirely. 3 years after being mocked for skipping combat, I was leading an organization that had redefined what combat actually meant in the modern world. We weren't fighting with rifles and explosives. We were fighting with knowledge and understanding, using the earth itself as our primary weapon. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.